There's a question I've been sitting on since I started going down this UAP rabbit hole that I haven't addressed directly yet because I haven't figured out a reasonable way to frame it until now. The question isn't whether UAP are interacting with human consciousness. The research on that is pretty substantial. There's cases on that across decades and cultures, and the US government ran a classified program with a specific name specifically studying the interaction between UAP and human awareness. And they called it Project Consciousness. And the question I want to get into today is, what are the actual mechanisms that these beings are using to interface with human consciousness? What does it look like technically? How would you build something that can read a human mind, or reach into one? And how would we even recognize it if we encountered it? Well, just this year in 2026, a peer-reviewed paper asked exactly that question. It proposed 3 specific mechanisms for how non-human intelligence might interface with human cognition. 3 separate hypotheses, each with a different technical framework, each with a different category of supporting evidence. The second mechanism we're going to get into is the most enticing to me because it draws on current technology that we're developing right now. In 2008, the Defense Intelligence Agency launched a classified program called AAWSAP. $22 million and 50 investigators, scientists, physicists, biologists, intelligence analysts. And most people who know about the AAWSAP focus on the UAP sightings that it documented, the radiation anomalies and the physical phenomena. But there's something about that program that I haven't seen a lot of coverage of. One of its internal research threads had a specific name, called Project Consciousness. And this wasn't just a program that was squeezed into the margin of a page somewhere. It was named, funded, and specifically dedicated to understanding the interaction between UAP phenomena and human awareness, perception, and physiology. The Defense Intelligence Agency, the same agency that produces intelligence assessments for the Secretary of Defense, decided at some point that understanding what UAP does to the human mind was important enough to fund as a separate named project within an already classified program. They didn't just study what the UAP looked like, they studied what the UAP did to the people that encountered them. And what the investigators found at the primary research site gave them specific reasons to take that question seriously. Researchers described the phenomenon as appearing to respond to human intention and awareness, as if the act of paying attention with the human mind was itself part of the interaction. Focused mental states appeared to correlate with UAP activity. Orb appearances seemed to coincide with specific mental conditions in the investigators. This wasn't one person's subjective impression. It was a documented pattern across multiple trained investigators who came in as skeptics and left with accounts they couldn't explain with any conventional framework. The government named it Project Consciousness because that's what it was, sitting in the internal documentation of a $22 million Defense Intelligence Agency program. Which brings me to the question that a 2026 peer-reviewed paper finally tried to answer properly. If something is interfacing with human consciousness, how? But before we get into those mechanisms, I think it's important to establish why we're asking this question at all. Because if there's no actual evidence that this consciousness interaction is actually occurring, then the mechanisms are all speculation anyway. But there is actually credible evidence. Military pilots and documented high-credibility UAP encounters, cases that are now in declassified government files, describe objects to appear and anticipate their intentions and maneuvers in real time. They weren't reacting to them, they were anticipating them. The pilot began to form an intention of a maneuver, and the object had already responded before the action was taken. That specific behavioral pattern appears across multiple independent classified pilot accounts. It's also documented in the 2026 paper that we're going to be discussing. It's the observation that made the researchers ask the mechanism question in the first place. If something's responding to the pilot's intention before the pilot acts on it, then something's reading the pilot's mind, in real time, at range, with enough fidelity to distinguish intention from background neural activity. And that's not describing the feeling of being watched. That's a specific technical capability. And the question of what that capability looks like mechanically is what this video is all about. The paper is called Crypto-Terrestrial Non-Human Intelligence and Anomalous Cognition. Yep, there's that crypto-terrestrial word again. The paper hypothesizes mechanisms for anticipatory awareness in UAP encounters. The researchers drew on the pilot testimonies, parapsychological research, and this is the part that makes this paper different from most UAP research, emerging brain-computer interface technology. It turns out we already know something about how to read intentions from brain signals because we're building that technology right now. The first mechanism that the paper proposes is the most ancient idea and the one that sounds the most like science fiction to me, and that's biological telepathy, a naturally evolved capacity for direct mind-to-mind information transfer without any technological medium. Now honestly, the evidence for this one is very thin compared to the second mechanism, and I think the paper's author would agree with that assessment. What exists is a documented statistical pattern, government-sponsored parapsychology research, including programs at Stanford Research Institute and Princeton's Paralab that ran for decades. and they found what researchers described as statistically non-zero anomalous cognition effects. These weren't dramatic demonstrations, they were small, reproducible statistical departures from chance and controlled experiments on information transfer between minds. The scientific community is still divided on what those results mean. Some researchers think that effect is real and unexplained, and others think that it's just a statistical artifact, but that debate has not been resolved. What this UAP paper adds to this specific framework is that if a non-human intelligence evolved in an environment fundamentally different from the human evolutionary environment, underground, in the ocean, in conditions where electromagnetic communication was unavailable or unreliable, then a biological capacity for direct neural communication might have developed the way that echolocation developed in bats. It wasn't supernatural, it was just adaptive, a sensory system that emerged because the environment selected for it. We evolved to communicate through air and sound because that was adaptive in our environment. Something that evolved in a different environment may have developed a different primary communication channel. That's the mechanism one argument, and it's speculative, but it's grounded in evolutionary logic rather than mythicism. Mechanism 2 is the one I want to spend a little more time on because I think it's the most important and the most overlooked. And that's technologically mediated neural decoding, a system analogous to brain-computer interface technology, reading human intentions from brainwaves in real time using a technological apparatus rather than a biological one. And why is this mechanism a little bit different than the others? Well, because we're doing this right now, with technology that developed in the last decade. At UC Berkeley, researchers built an AI model that translates neural activity into complete sentences for people who can't speak. The system reads brain signals and reconstructs the words the person intended to say without the person vocalizing anything. Meta built an AI decoder that can predict intended speech simply by analyzing brain activity, not just saying what someone said, but saying what they were about to say. And Neuralink's implant that's currently in human patients lets paralyzed individuals control digital devices using only their thoughts. The system reads the electrical patterns of intended movement from the motor cortex and translates them into commands before the body has made any physical movement. And that last detail is critical, before any physical movement. The system reads the intention, not the action. The thought and not the consequence of the thought. And we built that with roughly a decade of serious development using technology that didn't exist in a meaningful way before 2010. Now I took that and put it up against the UAP encounter data. Objects responding to pilot intentions before the pilot acts. Witnesses describing information just arriving in their minds without passing through any other senses. There's a pattern of documented cognitive effects that appear to be too specific and consistent to be random. And the paper's argument is pretty straightforward. If we can build intention-reading technology in just a decade, what could something build in 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or longer? You can think of the current Neuralink and something that's been developed for a magnitude of time longer as the difference between the Wright brothers biplane and a modern fighter jet. The principle is the same, but the capability is completely unrecognizable. And the objects in the military pilot encounters aren't just reading intentions, they're anticipating them. Responding before the action, which means whatever's doing this has enough fidelity to distinguish the moment an intention forms in the pilot's neural activity. And that's not science fiction, that's the more advanced version of something Neuralink already does in a hospital in California. The third mechanism is the one the paper describes as incomprehensible modalities exploiting undetected brainwave or biofield channels. Now what does that phrase mean? Because I had no freaking clue when I first read it, but I found out it's not a scientific explanation. It's an acknowledgement that the observed phenomena might be operating through channels of human neurobiology that we haven't detected or characterized yet. Now when I read stuff like that, it usually sounds like a cop-out, but this time it's not, and here's why. The human brain generates electromagnetic fields. We've known this since the 1920s when Hans Berger first recorded the EEG brainwaves. And the EEG is now a standard diagnostic tool in neurology. What we don't fully understand is the extent and nature of those fields beyond the skull. We measure them from the scalp, and we know they extend beyond the brain itself. We know the human heart generates an electromagnetic field that extends several feet from the body. The Biofield concept. The idea that living organisms generate and interact through electromagnetic fields that we haven't fully mapped. And that's not fringe science, it's being actively researched at institutions including the Heart Math Institute and has published literature going back decades. It's contested and it's not settled, but I wouldn't consider it pseudoscience either. The third mechanism in the paper is essentially this. If consciousness operates partly through electromagnetic channels beyond what standard neuroscience has fully characterized, and there's evidence suggesting it does, then a technology or biology sophisticated enough to interface with those channels could interact with human cognition in ways that appear inexplicable from within our current scientific framework. And the missing time phenomenon in UAP encounters keeps popping in my head when I'm going through this. Witnesses who experience missing time aren't describing it in the same way that someone who got knocked unconscious would describe it. They describe a gap in experience itself, like a discontinuity, as if a section of time simply didn't render. If something can interface with Biofield channels through which consciousness partly operates, not just reading signals but modulating them, then the altered time perception, the missing time, the hyperial quality of the experience that witnesses consistently describe as more real than ordinary walking life. All of those effects become mechanically explainable without requiring anything supernatural. The mechanism is unknown, but the effect is documented, and the gap between those two things is where the most interesting research is happening right now. Now I want to zoom out a little bit, because every time I start looking into something new, I start to think about how this impacts stuff that I've covered in the past. The crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. Whatever UAP are, they may be indigenous to this planet rather than somewhere else. If that's true, then the consciousness interfacing capability isn't a feature of spacecraft from another system. It's a capability that developed here, on Earth, over whatever timescale the intelligence has been operating. And then there's the Ariel school case. 62 children in Zimbabwe independently describing information arriving in their minds as thoughts. No technological apparatus visible, no physical contact, just direct cognitive transmission. If Mechanism 2 is operating, which is technologically mediated neural decoding and transmission, the technology doing it doesn't necessarily have to look like anything that we recognize as technology. Something that's had thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years, to refine what Neuralink does today. It could be a field effect or something ambient, something that doesn't require implants or visible equipment because it's operating at the electromagnetic level of the brain itself. And people that have had these encounters have had a renewed sense of reality. Some people have even reported a reduced fear of death and lasting psychological changes. If something can write to human consciousness as well as read from it, then that transformation might not be a side effect. It might be the output, the intended result of a very specific kind of contact. Now, I don't know if this is actually happening, but the witnesses that came forward are pretty credible. But I think the mechanism framework is the right way to think about this. Not whether it's real, but how does it work? Because once you have a serious technical hypothesis for how it works, the question stops becoming philosophical and starts becoming scientific. And again, the paper is called Crypto-Terrestrial Non-Human Intelligence and Anomalous Cognition, and it hypothesizes mechanisms for anticipatory awareness in UAP encounters. It's at academia.edu and it's free to read. The BCI research I referenced, the meta-speech decoder, the UC Berkeley's neuroscience reconstruction, it's all publicly available and easily searchable. The question I want to leave you with is one the paper doesn't answer. Of the three mechanisms, biological telepathy, technologically mediated neural decoding, or something operating through channels we haven't characterized yet, which one do you think is the most likely? That's all I got on this one today, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. My voice is still recovering from being a little bit ill. I thought it was allergies last week. Apparently it wasn't. Thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate all the support you guys have been giving me. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, hit that like button. I'd love to hear your comment on this one. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.